Okay, so tonight we continue our study of the minor prophets, more specifically the book of Hosea. And if you remember, last week we studied chapter 9. And if you look at the end of chapter 9 of Hosea, where we finished last week, you'll see that we were left with the image of people wandering. Hosea chapter 9, verse 17, which is the last verse of chapter 9, says, "My God will reject them because they have not listened to him. They shall be wanderers among the nations." And you remember many hard things were said to the people of Israel in chapter 9, including this last thought that they will be wanderers among the nations. And this would have been a hard thing for them to accept, this pronouncement by the prophet Hosea that Israel, God's chosen people, the 10 northern tribes, would find themselves to be outside of the land and wandering among the nations. And it would have been hard for them to accept for two reasons, I think. One is, as we've often discussed, times in northern Israel during the days of Hosea were prosperous. They had enough of everything. They were much stronger than the tribe of Judah down south, and they were well situated in the world. And so it would have been probably actually hard for them to believe when the prophet said, "You're going to be dispersed, you're going to be wanderers among the nations." But of course there's a second reason why they would have found it difficult to accept this prophecy, and that is that hard prophecies are hard for people to accept. People don't like to believe that bad things will happen. And here was the prophet Hosea, against all expectations, prophesying the very worst thing that they could probably imagine, that they would be evicted from the land of promise and they'd be dispersed among the nations. And this, among other things, is one of the marks of a true prophet, as we discussed last week. Every time and every place has many false prophets who will stand up and tell people, especially people with power or people who pay them somehow, what they want to hear. But one of the marks of a true prophet throughout the Bible is that true prophets are willing to say things even when people do not want to hear these things, which is to say they're willing to speak the words of God to people even though the words of God are unacceptable and unappealing. And as I mentioned last week, to some people they'll hear these difficult words, and these will be the words of their salvation. When a true prophet speaks, Old Testament or New, some people have ears to hear that prophecy right, and they'll turn to God and be saved. And some people don't have the ears at that time to hear what the prophet is saying and to believe it. And so those words will just be hard words, although they may not even care or pay attention. They may call the prophet a fool, like we talked about last week, but it just won't have any effect on them. So God's hard words spoken through the prophets are, as strange as it seems, they're words of love. They are God's words spoken to people so that he can save some of those people. The hard words are not anything else. And so as we hear many hard words through the prophet, remember, true prophets are speaking these words because God is trying to save people and turn them back to himself. All right, so that was what was going on last week in chapter 9. Tonight we start chapter 10, and we'll easily finish chapter 10 tonight, I believe. And let me just begin by reading the first verse. So, Hosea chapter 10, the first verse reads as follows. Israel is a luxuriant vine that yields its fruit. The more his fruit increased, the more altars he built. As his country improved, he improved his pillars. So the people in northern Israel are having trouble hearing this word of Hosea. And God and the prophet are working hard so that people can hear this word and be saved by it. part of what they're doing is showing people their sin and threatening them with the punishment that will surely come if they don't turn back to God and reform. All right. And so in the lesson that begins tonight in chapter 10, the prophet begins by acknowledging that the people are indeed very prosperous. All right. He says, Israel is a luxuriant vine that yields its fruit. Are you still reading the King James Version, Sam? Because the King James Version says something a little bit different. You might be. Okay. So most of the modern translations say something like this: Israel is a luxuriant vine that yields fruit. And my slide is showing a picture in the background of grapevines that are luxuriant. There's lots of fruit on the branches, and that's the image of Israel that the prophet wants to begin his lesson with. He wants to take their prosperity as a starting point. Remember, the reason they have trouble believing the prophet is because they're prosperous, and he's forecasting doom. He says, okay, you're luxuriant, let's start there. Okay. Now, Israel is not prosperous because they're good, right? They're fruitful because God is gracious. And this is something that we can easily understand from everything we read in the Bible. They've done all kinds of bad stuff. They've been disobedient to God. There's a spirit of whoredom in the kingdom. And yet they're prosperous, and their prosperity is God's grace. God is blessing them anyway. If they would only realize it, and the prophet's trying to help them to realize it, they're taking advantage of the grace of God. God has given them these things despite the fact they don't deserve them, and yet they're not using them properly, and they're going farther and farther away from God. He prospers them despite themselves. And this has happened throughout the history of mankind, as we read about it in the Bible anyway, hasn't it? You know, in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, God created a perfect world. He created Adam and Eve in his own image. He gave them a few simple rules, and everything was perfect. He blessed them. That was all grace. The creation of God is God's grace. He didn't have to create. He did so. And yet, what did the first two human beings do with God's grace? They use it as an opportunity to sin. This happened, you'll see it again with Cain and Abel. And after God nearly wiped out the whole world because of its wickedness in the flood, and yet preserved the world because he found favor with Noah, within a few generations, because Noah found favor with him, within a few generations the whole world had descended into wickedness again, and stays that way to this day. God chose a people for himself, Israel, delivered them from out of slavery in the land of Egypt. No sooner than they get out of Egypt and they're free and they're headed towards the land of promise, what do? They build a golden calf and they worship that. The very thing that God told them not to do. And it continues and continues and continues and continues throughout the Old and the New Testament. What we see is God blesses people. They use it as an opportunity to sin. Okay? And that's what we have here in the northern kingdom of Israel. I was thinking, even when Jesus tells the parable of the prodigal son, it's pretty much the same old story. You know, it's a prosperous family, and one of the sons takes his blessing as an opportunity to go off and sin until he's wasted everything and suffers, and then the father takes him back. That's what God is doing with his people throughout history. All right. So in this slide, we have the age-old story that the people are prosperous despite their sin. And they're using their prosperity to sin even more, right? And the picture I have up again is a luxuriant vine in the background. In front is a picture of, actually I think this is a picture of the Tower of Babel, which is one of the stories in the Bible that makes this point. Is people in their prosperity will do things that are offensive to God and disobedient to God. The more prosperous they are, it says in verse 1, the more their fruit increases, the more altars they build, the more their country improves, they improve their pillars. Right? So their prosperity is not a sign of their good favor with God. Their prosperity is a sign of God's grace despite all of the wicked things that they have done. And so God is going to have to help them a different way. Being gracious to them is not helping them. It's driving them farther away and into greater danger. So in verses 2 and 3, we read, Their heart is false. Now they must bear their guilt. The Lord will break down their altars and destroy their pillars. For now they will say, we have no king, for we do not fear the Lord. And a king, what could he do for us? So the people in the north probably think of themselves as being very religious people. They may even think of themselves as being very faithful to Yahweh, the God of Israel. Except we know from reading our Bible that they're continuing separation from the house of David. They're continuing to worship in the north with idols they constructed for themselves rather than being reconciled with the house of David and worshiping in the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. That's a continuing rebellion against God. The northern kingdom is a picture of rebellion against God. So we know that, and in addition to that, God can see their heart, just like he can see all of our hearts. And what God knows about their heart, the prophet tells us here, is that their heart is false. All right? And I think actually that's true for every unregenerate soul, not just the people in northern Israel, people in our time, people in all times. God sees the heart, and the Bible teaches us, Old Testament and New, that no one is without sin, right? And so that sin is run rampant in the northern kingdom, especially because God has blessed them so. God sees that their heart is false, and he says here that now is the time for them to bear their guilt. Verse 2, the Lord will break down their altars and destroy their pillars. And so that's the picture that I've tried to put up here. On the left you see a picture of the people having a sort of drunken celebration around the golden calf, which was the state of worship in northern Israel in these abundant times. And God is saying that he's going to have to put a stop to that. He can see their heart, and it's not good. So he's going to break down all of the pillars and all of the altars that they've built. And I was thinking, I don't know, I haven't thought about it for a while, but probably every civilization in human history, wouldn't you say, that rose to a position of extreme power and prosperity had a tendency to collapse under the decadence of its own prosperity, right? I mean, Rome was that way, and a lot of the kingdoms of Europe are not what they once were. The United States, Ricky and I always feel, is on the verge of collapsing in on its own iniquity. You know, it's just the way things are. God blesses people not because we're good. Since Adam and Eve, nobody's been good. The blessings that we receive are just because God is gracious. And yet we're so perverse that we take God's blessings and we make ourselves even worse. And so in order to save some, God sends his prophets like Hosea to speak to us, and God sends very difficult circumstances to people so that they can realize the truth and turn back to the Lord. And that's what the prophet Hosea is saying to the northern kingdom is about ready to happen. They have trouble to believe it because things are good, but the godly people will look inside their kingdom the way some of us look in our countries and say, yeah, the prophet's got a point. I can see that. You know, we've turned away from God and we're in danger. Okay. Verse 3 says, you know, that they are going to be, all of their stuff, their pillars and everything are going to be broken down. Their kingdom will be taken away. Verse 3 says, for now they will say, we have no king. No king means no kingdom. You can't have really a king without a kingdom or a kingdom without a king, right? If there's a king ruling, that means there's a kingdom there someplace. If the kingdom is torn down, having a king is meaningless or maybe impossible. And when these things happen, the prophet says, you're going to say to yourself, we don't have a king, we don't have a kingdom, because we don't fear the Lord. It's the bad thing that's coming that's going to remind them about the Lord. They're going to realize that their problem is coming from the fact that they don't fear the Lord. And they're even going to say to themselves, and since the Lord is not with us, I'm still in verse 3, what good would it do to have a king? You can't appoint a king for yourself if God's not behind it. There's no power in it. It won't achieve anything, right? They should understand. The history of Israel since King David has proven that the prosperity of the kingdom comes from God's relationship to the king and to the promises that God made. All right, so The people are going to realize when the nation is thrown down that they have been thrown down because they haven't feared the Lord. Then in verse 4, Hosea says, they utter mere words, with empty oaths they make covenants. So judgment springs up like poisonous weeds in the furrows of the field. Okay. He's speaking of the northern kingdom. He says they utter mere words, empty oaths. That's how they make their covenants. Okay. So judgment springs up like poisonous weeds in the furrows of the field. So the way I understand this verse is this way. The people in the north were religious. Just like the people in Rome were religious when Paul visited the Areopagus. He said, I can see that you people are very religious. You have statues everywhere, right? It's the same thing in the northern kingdom. You can see they're very religious. They have high places and places of animal sacrifice every place. Golden calves, 2 of them they have. Not only that, not only do they have this taste for religion, but they are God's chosen people. They're the descendants of Jacob. They are part of the people whom God chose. They've been specially chosen and blessed by God. Their history is the history of God's activity among men. Their history is the history of Moses, of the 10 Commandments and all of the teachings, all of the words that God has spoken into Israel. These people have as their cultural background. So, of all the people in the earth, the people in the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel are especially blessed insofar as they know more about the true and living God than anybody else does, because they're the ones that God has chosen to reveal himself to. Okay. And so, when he speaks of the furrows of the field, my understanding of the image is that Israel is like ground that's prepared for careful planting. They have Moses. They have the 10 Commandments. They have a knowledge of God. They have a religious sensibility. They have God's blessing. They have actually places among them. Bethel was a very special place where God appeared to Jacob and all of that. They live in the land where God manifested himself to the people. They have all those advantages. The land seems like it should be able to grow God's chosen people healthy in a field like that. The nations are rocky soil, and a lot of work has to be done before people can even hear about God. But in Israel, it should be able to grow good corn or something. But he says what happens instead is because their heart is, because they utter empty oaths and make empty covenants. They're all lip service. Their heart is not pure, he said before. Their words are empty. What actually comes up from the field of Israel is poisonous weeds. The field is plowed, the field is harrowed, the field has furrows, the field is ready for planting, and what's coming up is weeds because the people are planting empty words. If you remember 2 weeks ago in chapter 8, verse 7, the prophet said they have sowed the wind and they reaped the whirlwind. And we understood that the wind that they sowed was emptiness, nothingness, empty words, right? And it's the same image here. They're sowing empty words again. And this time, rather than speaking of the whirlwind that they'll harvest, he's using a different metaphor, and he's saying they're going to harvest weeds in the furrows of the field. People have understood this in 2 ways, and sometimes people want to understand it in both ways. If they're speaking of the covenant between Israel and God, okay, so we've paid lip service to God. Think of it. Everything you read in the Old Testament. Moses came down with the Old Testament, with the 10 Commandments, and the people with one voice said, yes, we'll obey everything that you said, right? And the next thing you know, they're building a golden calf. So Israel has always said with their mouth that they would follow Yahweh, that they would obey Yahweh, that they would turn back to Yahweh. But in fact, their words have been empty so far. And the Bible is the story of the infidelity of Israel. They have all the advantages, and yet they don't obey Yahweh. Their words are empty, except for a few people, right? And so, if what the prophet is talking about here is the empty words of the people spoken to God, okay, then then the poison that comes up in the field in this image would be God's punishment finally coming to them. They sowed the wind, they reaped the whirlwind. They sowed empty words, empty covenants, they reaped poisonous weeds. So rather than the blessing that God might have grown there in Samaria, what's coming up is weeds, and it's God's punishment, and they're going to be pushed out of the land, and that's going to be over. Some people read empty words differently. They think of these are empty words spoken to human beings. Among themselves, to Egypt, to Assyria. They were very unfaithful people in their dealings with other human beings. They were God's people. They had the laws. They knew what was right and wrong. You're not supposed to lie, and you're not supposed to covet and all of that. And yet, their words were empty, and the way they treated people really was quite bad. All right, and so then you might think that what comes up in the field, these poisonous weeds, are all of the earthly, worldly calamities that befall them. They're going to cause them to be forced out of the land. And really, I think you wind up concluding both things can be true. It's just their words are not faithful, or not meaningful. They're not contentful. They should be for people who descended from Abraham and who had the benefit of Moses, but they're not. And that's why God's going to send them out of the land, because the only thing that's growing in the plowed field in northern Israel is weeds, poisonous weeds. Or in other words, they're reaping what they sowed, which is an agricultural metaphor the Bible uses a lot. They're getting what they deserve. The chickens are coming home to roost. I guess Japan has lots of maxims like that also. You get what you pay for. Nothing's free. All right, so they're getting what they deserve. And I think you can understand why Hosea is here now, because they're having trouble believing the prophecy because they're prosperous, and yet he's saying that bad times are coming because of their disobedience. And he's trying to help them see just how disobedient they are and just how likely it is that his prophecy is going to come true. And again, I would say some people in northern Israel hear this and they're saved by it, but most of them we know are not, and the nation itself will be dispersed into the world and disappear. Okay, then in verses 5 and 8, 5 through 8, sorry. My brain is not working. Verses 5 through 8 are this way. Chapter 10, verse 5 says, "The inhabitants of Samaria tremble for the calf of Bethaven. Its people mourn for it, and so do its idolatrous priests. Those who rejoiced over it and over its glory, for it has departed from them. The thing itself shall be carried to Assyria as tribute to the great king. Ephraim shall be put to shame, and Israel shall be ashamed of his idol. Samaria's king shall perish like a twig on the face of the waters. The high places of Avon, the sins of Israel shall be destroyed. The high places of Avon, the sin of Israel shall be destroyed. Thorn and thistle shall grow up on their altars, and they shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us." So remember in last week's reading, chapter 9 at the beginning, starting in verse 1 of chapter 9, the prophet was warning the people, rejoice not, do not rejoice. And we talked about why that message was coming from the prophet, and somebody said because God is not happy with them. And that's right. They were rejoicing because they were prosperous, and yet if they only realized, if they would only listen to Hosea and the other prophets, their prosperity was nearing the end. That's why they should not rejoice. Now here in chapter 10, we see them mourning rather than rejoicing. This is something the prophet sees in the future. And he says, the inhabitants of Samaria tremble for the calf of Bethaven. The people mourn for it, right? So I have a picture of a person mourning, crying, weeping, because their religion is being taken away from them. The calves are being taken away from them. If you're a priest, your job is being taken away from you. If you're a king, your supposed power is being taken away from you. The God of Israel, the religion of Israel is being taken away from you. And now they're mourning. And I dare say that while they're rejoicing in their prosperity for the wrong reason, which everyone can understand, they're also mourning for the wrong reason in the vision of the prophet, because they're not mourning because they've offended God. They're not mourning because they were separated from Yahweh. They're mourning because of the loss of their false gods and all of the things that go with it. We're talking the inheritance of Samaria, that's the people in northern Israel, are trembling because of the calf. Its people are mourning for it, for the calf of Bethaven, the golden calf. The priests are mourning for it because it's been taken away. They rejoiced over it before, that was last week's lesson, over its glory, but now it's departed from them. So the thing itself, that is the golden calf, I have a little arrow, says it's being pushed over to Assyria. It's being pushed out of the kingdom. And they're weeping because the calf is being removed from them. Okay. The thing itself shall be carried to Assyria as a tribute to the great king. Ephraim shall be put to shame, and Israel shall be ashamed of his idol. Okay. So they're not sad because they've forsaken Yahweh. They're sad because their idol is going away. When the God that you thought was the source of your power, that you held up to other nations as the source of your power, has to be given away to another nation as a tribute to try to save yourself, to try to save your kingdom, what you're proving to the world is that your God has no power, and your nation has no power, and you have no power. And by the way, all of the stuff that you said and did before that was based on the assumption that the golden calf and all of that had power just makes you look stupid. Right? They're embarrassed, the prophet says. They'll be put to shame. Israel will be put to shame because everything that they're now rejoicing over is going to prove to have been something that wasn't real, that was taken away from them. They have no power. They have no nation. They have no king. Okay. So when God removes his protection from them, they're going to be ashamed. Verse 7, it says, Samaria's king shall perish like a twig on the face of the waters, which is the picture in the lower right-hand corner. The prophet wants them to understand that their great, prosperous, glorious king, as they now see him, when the prophet's talking, who's powerful and has all this stuff, is going to be reduced to something so weak and insubstantial that you could compare him to a twig floating around on the face of the water. That's how he's going to be. So their God will be gone. That is their false God. All that goes with it will be gone. Their nation will be gone. Their king will be gone. They'll be obscured and ashamed, and they'll mourn because all of that is passing away. And then in verse 8 it says, the high places of Avon, the sin of Israel, shall be destroyed. Thorn and thistle shall grow up on their altars, and they shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. So the thorn and thistles are images of overgrowth. The northern kingdom, which was like a field plowed and ready to grow, it's growing weeds instead. They're going to be dispersed to the nation, and the land that was once the land of promise to these people will just be growing thistles, and the blessing will be removed from it. But I'm particularly interested in this last part that says that they shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. Because Jesus quoted these words. Last week, I pointed out to you guys that in Luke 23:29. Look back in Luke. Here's two quotes from Hosea mixed together by Jesus. So in Luke chapter 23, verse 29, which is while Jesus is almost ready to be crucified, and the women are weeping, and Jesus says, don't weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. Then verse 29 says, for behold, the days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. That was a quote from Hosea that we looked at last week. And then if you continue reading into verse 30, Jesus says, "Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" So can you see that Jesus has taken two quotes from the prophet Hosea and put them together? The one about there being a time coming when it would be better if no babies could be born. Barrenness will be a blessing. Because there's something worse than not existing. There's something worse than not being born. What's worse than that is living in the time that's coming. It's a time when being alive is not worth it, right? And when Jesus quotes the passage from chapter 10 here where he says, "Fall on us and to the hills cover us," I'll go back to Hosea now. Because this is verse 8 of chapter 10. This is, if I understand it correctly, quite simply speaking of suicide. Right? A time is coming that's so bad that people are going to say, "Please kill me, drop a mountain on me, hide me. I'm humiliated, I'm miserable, I don't want to be alive." And so the prophet, is trying to help people understand it'll be that bad for people who don't turn back to God. But interestingly, Jesus remembered those verses from the prophet Hosea and quoted them also. And Jesus is looking farther forward. If you want to look in Revelation chapter 6, verse 16, you'll see something similar. Revelation chapter 6, verse 16, unless I made a mistake in my notes. Okay. Starting at verse 15, Revelation chapter 6, verse 15. John says, "Then the kings of the earth and the great ones and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone, slave and free, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, 'Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of God. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand?'" Right. So it's the same voice that goes out from the prophet Hosea, from the Lord Jesus, from the Apostle John in his Revelation. There's a time coming that will be so bad that it would be better not to be alive when for some people, when that happens. All right, and so that's what the people in the northern kingdom need to fear now. It would be better for them to be dead than to live through what's coming to those that don't turn back to the Lord. Hosea chapter 10, verses 9 and 10. It's kind of a continuation of the same thought using a different image. Verse 9 says, "From the days of Gibeah you have sinned, O Israel, there they have continued. Shall not the war against the unjust overtake them in Gibeah? When I please, I will discipline them, and nations shall be gathered against them when they are bound up for their double iniquity." So this is the third time in this class that we have come across reference to Gibeah. And the second time we've come across reference to the days of Gibeah. Last week in chapter 9 also, chapter 9 verse 9 and chapter 10 verse 9 both speak of the days of Gibeah. And early in chapter 5, Gibeah was mentioned in another context. And as we discussed last week, the point of referring to Gibeah is the incident that happened there as told in Judges chapter 19 and 20. And once again, if you've forgotten from last week, what happened there in Judges 19 and 20 was there was a Levite and his concubine traveling. They had to stay the night somewhere. They turned to a town in Benjamin called Gibeah. A man took them in and gave them hospitality. The story there is very, very similar to what you remember from the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. In the nighttime, the townspeople came out. They wanted to molest this Levite and his concubine. Finally, the concubine was put outside. The townspeople molested her and killed her. And in the morning, the Levite came out and cut the body into pieces, sent it out to the corners of the kingdom as a testimony to this evil thing which had been done in Israel, in the tribe of Benjamin, in the town of Gibeah. And 10% of the able-bodied men drew arms, and they came there, and they nearly wiped out the whole tribe of Benjamin. They were instruments of the Lord's wrath directed at an act which is purely wicked and should never happen in Israel. And so this story continued in the history of Israel. I said before that the northern kingdom had the benefit of this whole history of God's activity in their memory, something that the nations weren't blessed with. But they knew this story, and the prophet has brought it out now for the third time to warn them that it's going to be like that. That's what's coming. All right? They did something very wicked, and the retribution came. And it was severe, nearly total. All right? You guys are doing something now, the retribution will come, and it will be severe, nearly total. But here I think that there's something more going on. So it's, again, back to the verse 9, it says, from the days of Gibeah you have sinned, O Israel. So he's saying, your sinning which began in Gibeah has continued until this day. And some might think that's strange, but the thing you have to realize is, just because the other tribes of Israel were instruments of God's punishment to the tribe of Benjamin and Gibeah doesn't mean the other tribes were any better than Benjamin. God used the other tribes to discipline the offending tribe, but the wickedness is arguably the same throughout Israel, just like the wickedness is arguably the same throughout all of humanity. So after that punishment happened, people might have taken notice, their behavior might have been changed, but the wickedness continued. And God knows their hearts, He knows their empty words, He knows the falseness of their heart. There have been plenty of other evidences of wickedness in Israel, right? And so the wickedness that was punished at Gibeah in Judges 19 and 20 is still there. Okay, I think that thought is here in the beginning of chapter 9. And for people who turn aside and repent and turn to their God, those sins will not overtake them. But the people who remain unrepentant, the sins of that nation persist, right? The sins of that nation are going to culminate in the whole northern kingdom being wiped out. So in the example here, you have the other tribes disciplining Benjamin for a wicked act. In the example that we get in the prophet, God says that He's going to use the nations. This is in verse 10. He's going to use the nations against them. So the other tribes discipline Benjamin, nearly wiping it out. God says that same wickedness persists until this day, and I'm going to use the nations to discipline you. All right? It's the same pattern. It's the people are tools of God for the disciplining of His people in Gibeah in Judges 19 and 20, and it's coming again when the northern kingdom is dispersed by the nations, by the Assyrians in this case. So the culmination of this punishment is going to happen. And God says in verse 10, when I please, I will discipline them, which means this punishment is in God's hand. And when God chooses, He's going to execute that punishment. They're prosperous now, but they better worry because the prophet's telling them the punishment is there. It's waiting for you. Okay. Now my favorite slide. I don't know if you can see it or not, but actually this slide will be helpful to you to understand verses 11 through 13, I think. So now he changes to a different picture, and he says, Ephraim was a trained calf that loved to thresh. and I spared her fair neck. So the big picture behind everything is a picture of some people today in an African country, I think, threshing, manually threshing. If I showed you threshing in the United States, it would be a machine. But here, their threshing, way of threshing is similar to what the prophet would have had in his mind. And they harvest the grain, and the grain has to be separated from the stalks. And these guys have pulled all of the wheat or whatever it is there. And the cows these are oxen, I guess, walking on it to separate the grain from the stalks. So threshing is basically separating the grain from the stalks that it grows on. If somebody knows more about threshing than me, please take me off the hook. But I think that I'm right, basically. And what the prophet says is Ephraim was a trained calf that loved to thresh. Can you imagine why, if you're a cow or an ox and you have to have some job on the farm, why you would prefer to do threshing than any other job they might give you?
Well, in Deuteronomy it says you shall not muzzle an ox while it threshes out.
Deuteronomy 25 verse 4, yeah. So Deuteronomy 25 verse 4 says, "Thou shalt not muzzle the oxen while they're..." So these cows here are walking on a lot of grain, and they don't have any yoke on. Their neck is easy. It's an easy job, and when they're hungry, they can just bend down and eat. And they've even got Moses on their side. He says it's okay for the cows to eat. And the point is that the prophet sees in the northern kingdom people who are like the cows in the big picture on the back. They've had everything provided to them. They've been blessed beyond anything that they deserve. They have all the grain and all the wine that they want. They've been protected from their enemies. God has withheld his wrath at their deviation from the house of David and the fact that their worship is strange, and he continued to bless them. And they continued to just eat all those blessings and just sin, right? That's the kind of cow they've been. And it's not helping them because they're not turning back to God, which is what they have to do if they're going to live. And so now he says, Ephraim was a trained calf that loved to thresh, and I spared her fair neck, right, from the yoke. You have to put on oxen if they're going to plow. But it says, but now Judah must plow. That's near the end of verse 11. And Jacob must harrow for himself. So down in the lower right-hand corner is a picture of plowing in some subtropical climate. I should have found one from North America. I mean, plowing is a lot harder because especially if you're a cow or an ox, because you have to pull the plow through rocks and hard ground and everything, and there's nothing to eat. It's just mud. Probably the water doesn't even taste too good there. So if you're the cow in the lower right-hand corner, that's a real job. If you're the cow in the upper, back corner, that's life. That's an easy life. And the prophet is saying the northern kingdom's going from A to B. They're going to go from being a threshing cow to being a cow that's yoked to a plow. And it says here, Jacob must harrow for himself. Actually, sorry. It said, I will put Ephraim to the yoke. Judah must plow. So that would be a picture of Judah down there in the lower right-hand corner. And it says Jacob must harrow. And here Jacob probably is not the whole of Israel, but still just the Ephraim, the northern kingdom. Harrowing is over there on the left. Harrowing is where, after somebody's broken up the ground, you hook a harrow to the animals, and they pull to smooth out the lumps and stuff like that in the ground, which is not necessarily any easier than plowing, but it's the same comparison to the job they used to have. You have to really work for a living, and again, there's nothing to eat, just hard work. So we don't have, yeah.
Back in the beginning times when they had this blessing, but this was a false blessing because they knew nothing, but the outcome is still the same. They're gonna go through a hard time.
What blessing you're talking about?
I'm talking about when they had a lot of, the first grain picture. They had nice lines, plants are growing.
Yeah.
But the people that were in that blessing knew nothing of God, right? The people of Israel. And so they say that you know nothing. The outcome is still the same. You're gonna still have nothing at the end. The prophecy. This is prophecy. In other words, so what I'm saying is that like in California now, they're having a big drought. You know, in the old days, they would be in the middle of a famine by now. But because man's know-how and they're eking out whatever they can, they're throwing fertilizer, but with no water, sooner or later it's going to dry up. So is that the same parallel? Without God's blessing, you can milk this thing, and it's going to be nothing anyway, because there's no thanks to God.
I'm not sure. I mean, I think the opening image, Israel as a luxuriant vine, is saying what we've known so far all along in Hosea is the time that the prophet is speaking, the northern kingdom is prosperous. So it has been blessed, not because it's good, but because God chose them and decided to bless them. It's the grace of God. And of course, what God's objective is that they would be faithful to Him and have a good relationship with Him and be godly people. So their prosperity, the picture of prosperity, is just physical prosperity. It's not spiritual prosperity. Their spiritual prosperity is better represented by the furrows that are growing poisonous weeds, right? It's not working out. So the physical prosperity He's given them is not producing the spiritual prosperity He purposes to achieve. And so in order to get them where they need to be spiritually, He has to take away their physical prosperity. So what we see here now is a kind of let's start over, all right? You like to walk around eating the grain that was just laying there for you, and that wasn't working out real good for you. But now I'm going to put a yoke on you. Like Judah, you're going to have to plow, you're going to have to harrow. It's going to be difficult. All of these images are images of difficulty, right? The easy times are almost over. Now you're going to become a beast of burden out in the field. And then he continues it here, and he says in verse 12, sow for yourselves righteousness, reap steadfast love. Break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the Lord, that He may come and rain righteousness on you. So this is a call to return, to clean up get rid of the weeds, plow everything under, harrow that, sow seeds of righteousness, reap a harvest of love so that God can rain righteousness on you. This is using farm imagery, the same message that's been going out and going out and going out. You know, you're corrupt. It's game over. It's finished now. I'm going to stop. I'm going to put a stop to that. You're going to be dispersed. But then the prophet's voice calls them back, right? When it was the lion, he says, he tears so that he may heal. Right? When it was the marriage images in the first 3 chapters, it was like a divorce that can be reconciled, right? I mean, the woman was cut off, but then suddenly she was restored. And so throughout Hosea, always we have this sort of mysterious, hopeful promise that in the end, God's people will be reconciled to Him. And the path to get there is through a lot of difficulty and hard work. Beginning in the case of Hosea from a place of prosperity, since he was the earliest of the minor prophets, probably to almost at least to preach in the northern kingdom, he would have seen the prosperous phase. And that would have been his sort of situation as he made prophecy and people listened to him. So a lot of the stuff he said was hard to understand and believe until later when things went bad. But Christ Himself quotes the prophet Hosea multiply, which means that the voice of this prophet was listened to seriously thereafter in the southern kingdom, in the time of the Babylonian captivity, and even in New Testament times. What the prophet was saying is still true for us too, right? Our prosperity leads us into all kind of sin. And oftentimes the hard times are what bring us back to God. And then God says, okay, let's plow again. Let's replant. You know, let's restore you. Is that an answer to your question?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think verse 12 here is a new beginning. Sow for yourselves righteousness, reap steadfast love. The steadfast love here is a Hebrew word I have trouble to pronounce, hesed or something like that, which is the kind of love that it is. It's charity towards human beings that flows from an abundance of your love for God. It is the kind of love that is here. So, they're not behaving well towards one another, and he's saying now you should sow righteousness, reap this kind of love, break up the fallow ground, which isn't, fallow ground is like land that's not doing anything, right? I mean, the field was plowed and weeds came up and now it lies fallow. Break it up, let's grow something good there. And then God is going to come and add an abundance of righteousness. So which would you rather have, a bunch of grapes like you've got now, or an abundance of righteousness raining from the Lord on people that he's reconciled with? They're sort of trading their worldly blessing for a spiritual blessing, I think. Right? And then, by contrast, in verse 13, he says, you have plowed iniquity, you have reaped injustice, you have eaten the fruit of lies, because you trusted your own way, and in the multitude of your warriors. All right, so the harvest that they have has been bad because they haven't trusted in God. It's just repeating that message again. You've trusted in your own ways instead of in the Lord, so your harvest has been bad. And so it says, the tumult of war shall arise among your people, and all your fortresses shall be destroyed, as Shalman destroyed Beth Arbel on the day of battle. Mothers were dashed in pieces with their children. Thus it shall be done to you, O Bethel, because of your great evil. At dawn, the king of Israel shall be utterly cut off. All right, so he's been talking all along that the day of retribution is nearly here. It's going to happen, right? They've explained to the people using images from their history in the Old Testament. They've explained to the people using foretellings of things that are about to come. They've explained to the people by pointing to iniquity that some of them will be able to see in themselves and in their fellow countrymen, to try to make them believe and understand that the only thing now for you to do is to turn back to God. Right? But the return is going to be on the other side of a lot of difficulty now for the people in northern Israel. And so this ends by saying that you didn't trust God, and because of that, the tumult of war is going to rise against you. And that's, according to what I looked on the internet, that's actually a picture of an Assyrian soldier. I have no way to verify that, but it's supposed to be Assyrian. They have no saddle. But the Assyrian army is going to come and take them and their stuff away. It says here that as Shalman destroyed Beth Arbel on the day of battle, there's no historical record inside the Bible or outside the Bible that lets us know what the reference is to. Probably Shalman is an abbreviated form of Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria, almost for sure, who fought some battle in a place called Beth Arbel where mothers were dashed into pieces with their children. But there's no historical record of that, so we don't know any more about that than what we see here. The point anyway is, war is coming and they're going to lose. Right? And he's already said it'll be a time when it would have been better if no babies were born and women couldn't give milk, and it's going to be a bad time. It's going to be done to you because of your great evil. And then this last sentence, which says, at dawn the king of Israel shall be utterly cut off. And some people think that the at dawn statement is significant because it's like the dawn represents another prosperous day in the sunny northern kingdom. They're rejoicing in their prosperity. They're ignoring the true prophets that tell them to reform. A reckoning is coming, but they're not listening to the prophet's warning. A sunny day happens, and suddenly the Assyrians come, and that's it for them. Just like the New Testament is always saying, we don't know the day or the hour, right, when the Lord will come. You have to be ready all the time because the reckoning could come suddenly, like a thief in the night, Jesus says. So that may be the image that we have here, that the Assyrians are going to rise fairly quickly and sweep them away. It won't be in one day, but it'll be surprising to them. The other possibility is the sunrise just says pretty soon. I don't know, when the morning comes, it'll happen. But Again, and in different images than we've had before, but the same message is that the time of their punishment for their sin is at hand. Does anybody have any thought or comment or question?
So at this point, Hosea is using two analogies, one of the Porta and the one of the farm, to try and get this point across. Or is this a moving forward in the prophecy?
No. Thank you for asking that question. I mentioned last week, you weren't here last week, right? In the introduction, that in the Bible generally, and in Hosea in particular, there are a few key thoughts that are repeated again and again and again and again. And that's kind of how we know what's really important, because God says it many times in slightly different ways, through a lot of mouths, in a lot of circumstances. And we get it, right? As believers, we get it. It gets deeply in us, because it's like a hammer and an anvil. God is banging and banging and banging and banging. Get this message, until finally we're the tool that He wants us to be. And we're really hard, He has to hit us a lot and keep us kind of hot to shape us. And so my point is that in Hosea, his overall point is simple, right? If you turn away from the Lord, that will be bad, and punishment will come, but there's hope still, because God is a loving God who will be gracious beyond all of that. But He uses not just those two metaphors, but many. I haven't stopped to count how many figures of speech and metaphors He uses, but a lot. And I think the reason why is because the people are so hard. They're so resistant to the message the prophet is speaking. They just can't imagine that it could really be true, that the northern kingdom could fall, so quickly to the Assyrians. And why the northern kingdom instead of the south, which was much weaker than them. And yet they're being taken away with the northern gods, while Yahweh's people stay in business down there. The whole thing doesn't seem right to them. And so I think all of these metaphors, especially, or biblical examples like Gibeah, because these are strong examples to them. They probably, some of them at least, might have heard those stories growing up, as children or whatever. I don't know what religious education was like in the northern kingdom in 8th century BCE, but some of those stories they must have heard, otherwise Hosea wouldn't have used those stories to prophesy to them. And when he says it's going to be like Gibeah, anybody that's got an ounce of religious sensibility, the Holy Spirit's doing anything in them, is going to say, oh my gosh, it's going to be like that? Our sin is like that? Our punishment's like that? Right? So figures of speech, historical stories, predictions of the future, all of it the prophet is using, but it's not like he's saying anything new every time. It's like he's saying the same thing, better or different every time, so that they'll finally catch it. And that's why I sort of realized, because if you don't realize that, it seems awfully repetitive, right? I remember one time, you may not care, but I remember one time in Sunday school, we had a new Christian. She had a PhD in something. She was a really smart lady, but she was like a new Christian. And her question was, we were reading the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. She said, this seems really inefficient because Matthew, Mark, and Luke are saying basically the same thing. I mean, why didn't they just consolidate that into one gospel? And at first it struck me as an odd question, but she was a brilliant person who just had never knew anything about Christianity. And so I thought, oh, it's actually a very intelligent question, right? I mean, we accept it because we grew up with that kind of Bible, but she wanted to know. And it's the same kind of answer, right? I mean, God wants to make sure that the few things that are really important for our salvation get through. Old Testament, New Testament, Northern Kingdom, Southern Kingdom, prophecy, gospel, narrative history, whatever, song, psalm, proverb, wisdom literature. It's all basically just a few points that God is making, right? I guess. Just fair to say. Okay, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thanks again that people could take time out of their busy schedule on a hot, even rainy day, during a vacation even, to come to your house to study your word. And we thank you for each person here. You ask your blessing on everybody here. Ask your blessing on them as they go home, that they'll get home timely and safely and without any problem. Lord, we have been trying to record these studies for people who can't come here, and I can see that some people are taking advantage of that, so we ask that you have your eye on those people also, if they're participating in that way. To everyone who participates in this class or who just opens up their Bible on their own, we ask your blessing on our understanding. Please protect us from mistakes in our understanding and guide us into wisdom. And help us to always catch the most important things that are to be found in your word and to apply them in our lives and to become better. Also like to thank you for Kazuko-san translating every week so faithfully for so many years. Please bless her and let her know how thankful we are for her help and the gifts that you've given her. And for all of the other people who help here and other ministries in this church, I ask your blessing. Again, Lord, I ask you to bless the 45 English camp thing that's going on during the daytime here. Please help that to be very successful and pleasing in your sight. And we ask all of these things in Jesus' name. Amen.